Thanks so much for joining us on the Politics Hub this evening. What do you think when you see Labour saying that they weren't warned about how bad things are?
Well, of course, they knew to a large degree how bad things are in terms of the public finances. We and many others have made it very clear that that it was going to be very hard to avoid cuts over the next few years, given the proposals made by the previous government. It's also been very clear that, for example, things like children's social care, the prisons system, the court system, NHS waiting lists have been in a terrible state. We also knew that there were going to be big demands on public sector pay. So at the highest broad level, yes, of course, they knew, broadly speaking, how bad things were. I've no doubt they have discovered some specific issues, and particularly about how tough things are this year or immediately, which wouldn't have been quite so evident from the public pronouncement. So my guess is that that's what they're going to focus on Monday.
Some are even going so far as to suggest that the Chancellor's been dishonest. Do you think that's fair?
I think at a high level, the new government was well aware they were coming in facing a really difficult position in terms of the scale of problems facing the public services. There is no doubt that having taken over at the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office and the Department of Education and so on, they will have seen some things that they didn't know, and it may well be that things are even worse than they imagined. But there's no question that they knew that things were going to be difficult. My guess is they found that they are even more difficult and even more immediately than they had quite appreciated.
Does it slightly frustrate you when you sort of go out on the media around talking about a conspiracy of silence that only a few weeks later we're in this position?
It is frustrating that this wasn't addressed properly during the election campaign. Of course, as an opposition, Labour were looking to say that things were needed change. I mean, that was clearly their slogan for the election, and they needed change because we have very high waiting lists and so on, problems in the public services. But to get that change was always going to require some more money, and there was always a ducking of the issue about where that money might come from, both in the short and in the medium term. So in that sense, I mean, the whole phrase conspiracy of silence, which is one that I think I came up with after the March budget, it caught on, I think, because there was something of a conspiracy of silence between the two big parties because they didn't want to talk about the really tough choices that they're going to have to make.
We understand that in the coming days, the government are going to agree to above inflation pay rises for public sector workers across the board. That's going to be expensive. Just tell us a bit about how expensive that would be.
Well, public sector workers have done even worse than private sector workers over the last 15 years or so. So it was always going to be the case that it will be very difficult to keep their pay increases down below what's on average across the private sector at the moment. And that is, pay in the private sector is actually doing quite well right now, 5 or 6% increases. So it shouldn't come as any great surprise that the pay review bodies for the nurses and the teachers have suggested pay rises of between 5 and 6%. But that's going to be really expensive. As far as we can tell, the assumptions built into the amounts of money that the Department of Health and the Department of Education have was that pay would only go up by 1 or 2%. So the additional cost just for those two bits of the public sector, at least £3.5 billion. If you were to have the same amount across the entire public sector, then you might be looking at an additional cost of something like £10 billion relative to what's been budgeted for. And that is clearly quite a significant amount of money.
A tax rise is inevitable, and I guess they've tied their hands when it comes to the big revenue raises. How difficult is that going to make things?
It's clearly going to be difficult to square this circle. As we said during the election campaign, there was more in the Labour manifesto about what they would not do on taxes than about what they would or might do. So they're very clear. They won't increase national insurance, VAT, income tax or corporation tax, or at least the main rates of those taxes. It's worth saying that if, as has been speculated, Rachel Reeves comes out and says that the the hole in the public finances is around £20 billion. That's almost exactly the cost of the national insurance cuts that Jeremy Hunt introduced this year. So simply reversing those and getting back to where we were last autumn in national insurance would actually deal with a large part of the problem. It looks like Labour have ruled that out. That leaves them with much more difficult sorts of tax changes, quite technical changes to capital gains tax, perhaps, needs to happen, to be fair, and to inheritance tax. I mean, there are taxes that you could change, make them more equitable, and potentially get some more money from them. But the amount of money you get is somewhat more uncertain. It's not enormously big, and it's quite a complex thing to change.